Hello, welcome to Cozy Costume Creations. Today we're going to make the skirt that goes with this bodice. So this is for my vampire film, Shattered Soul. Look out for it when it comes out. It's gonna be good. It's gonna be good. And I'm going to make a cartridge pleated skirt to go with it. I'm going to show you guys how to do that. It's a really easy technique to do, and it makes a really beautiful period skirt look. I'm going to be doing these two together, and I'm going to cartridge pleat them to make a beautiful skirt. Cartridge pleat is a really easy, very fun type of pleat where you get kind of an accordion shape look, and it sits kind of out from the fabric like this. So it's gonna look something like that with like a whole ton of layers, a lot more. But we get a very fun shape that sits away like this versus most pleats, like a box pleat is done like this. You'll see it often on like skirts, sometimes on some pants. And you have something like that. So it's a pleat that sits flat. In this case, a box pleat, it makes kind of like a box, right? And so then you might have a lot of box pleats next to each other, bloop, bloop, doing a thing. So those are like the typical pleat. You also have knife pleats that'll go one direction, and they'll go like this. You kind of stack them on top, right? So other types of pleats kind of sit flat, but the cartridge pleat is pretty three-dimensional and it sticks out. So it's a very different type of pleat. But it's really great, especially for period gowns. It is something you have to do by hand. There's not a very easy way to do it by machine. You could, if you had a machine with like a very long stitch length, some of them have basting stitches that go up to like a 9, and you could get away with that kind of cartridge pleat look with some of that, but really you pretty much got to do it by hand. So that's also why it's a period technique, because this was before the invention of the sewing machine. And of course it, stayed for a while after the sewing machine was invented. So this gown is based on kind of an 1860s kind of period. So that is around the time where we have the Industrial Revolution. We get more of these things. But cartridge pleats have been around for a lot longer. You can see them in some like Elizabethan gowns, a lot of different places. So it's a beautiful technique. It's cool. Let's learn it. So I'm going to show you guys how to do it. It's pretty easy. I like to start with the skirts, because you don't need too many measurements and they're pretty simple and straightforward. So skirts are really easy because you only really need 2 measurements. All you need is waist and outseam. So outseam is the outside of this seam and it can end wherever you want it to. So if I'm going for a knee length skirt, then my outseam to knee, that's the measurement I would take. Obviously I don't want to bend because that would ruin it. You have someone else take those measurements for you so that you're not like squishing the measurement, right? And by the way, your waist is like right here. It is not down here and it is not all the way up here, right? So your natural waist sits kind of right above your hips. A lot of people, it falls in line with kind of your belly button, but not always. So what you want to do is get your waist measurement. Take that, and you can kind of shimmy the tape down to like right above your hips. You can kind of sway from side to side to see exactly where that is, and that's where your natural waist is. This is a period garment, so we're going to use a natural waist for this. Waistline does depend on the era. We have like the drop waist that comes later in like 1920s and is also popular in the 60s. But for a lot of period things, you have natural waist. Of course, we have the Empire waist, which is up here, and that's more like 1810s Regency era. But anyway, this is where your natural waist is. So when someone says natural waist, this is it. So I'm going to take this measurement, and I know that my waistband has to, at the end of the day, when everything is put together, that's the measurement it needs to sit at, right? Measurement. So I need waist, and then you only need outseam. This is a floor length gown. A lot of period garments, the dresses go all the way to the floor. So that's what we're going to do here. So I'm just going to take my measurement to the floor. Boop, boop. And I have that measurement. I think right here, like to the floor, it's like 40-ish inches for me. So I have those measurements, those 2 measurements, and I'm going to write those down. Now what I'm going to do is create a waistband. And I've already created this. It's just a rectangle. All you have to do is have the measurement of your waist, plus I'm doing a 2-inch overlap, because if I have these just meeting, there's no way for like, how is this going to stay on if they just touch, right? We could do like an invisible zipper, but this is a period garment, so we're not going to use zippers. So I'm going to have a 2-inch overlap so that I can have some hook and bars, some skirt hook and bars as my closure up here. And yeah, so I've added 2 inches so I can have a 2-inch overlap on my waist. That way I have my waistband and it can have 2 inches to overlap, and then that will be my center back seam. So I only want 1 seam and it's going to go down the center back. So it's pretty easy skirt, only 1 seam. Sometimes you'll have side seams, sometimes you'll have lots of other seams. It depends. This one, we're going to make it really easy, right? So I need to add my 2 inches to the measurement that I got. So I have my waist measurement plus 2 inches, so I have an overlap. And then I have to make a seam allowance, right? So you can't take 2 pieces of fabric and just butt them up against each other, right? You have to sew them with an overlap, and that is called a seam allowance, so that when I stitch these, there's something left over, right? I can't just stick them together because then it's going to fray out in the black meat, you know? So it's going to fray out that way, so it's not strong. So we have to have a seam allowance so that there is something there for you to stitch the fabric and then for it to sit open. And you got a seam, right? So seam would be here, my seam allowance is on the inside, right? So in this case, my seam allowance is inside here and here. I did a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance because that's like a normal, typical seam allowance is 5/8. If you're using a commercial pattern, almost every piece is going to have a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And then there are parts where they say, you know, maybe like a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, sometimes a quarter, but 5/8 is pretty standard. In theater, we use 1 inch a lot for side seams, and we would use 2 inches for center back. And that's so that you can change the garment to fit multiple sizes of people. So that if I were making this for theater, I'm not making it for film, but I'm using theater techniques because I'm a theater person. That's what I do. So with this, I did use a lot of those theater techniques kind of so I could show you. And also because I knew it wouldn't be that bulky on screen. But if it were going to be bulky on screen, I would want to cut my seam allowances and keep them nice and small, like a commercial or a fashion pattern of about 5/8. But anyway, so for the length of this, when you're cutting the fabric, you're going to have your waist measurement plus the 2 inches plus the 5-inch seam allowance for either end, right? Then I decide the width. How wide do I want my waistband? In this case, I wanted a 2-inch wide waistband. That feels pretty good to me. I like that. So I did 2 inches. So then for the width, I'm going to do 2 inches and then multiply that by 2 because it's folded over, right? So I have 4 inches, and then I need to have a seam allowance on either end, 5/8 on one end, 5/8 on the other. So that gives me a 5 1/4 inch. 5 1/4 inches is how long I cut it. So the width, 5 1/4, because I chose a 2-inch waistband, and then the length, waist plus 2 inches plus 5/8 on either side. I hope that makes sense. So that's how you get this. And then all you got to do is you stitch the sides, whoop, just this side, and then you stitch all on here at your 5/8 inch seam allowance. You leave this part open, then you flip it inside out. You do want to clip your edges, your corners, so they can be nice and tidy. We will talk about that another time. But yeah, you clip your edges, your corners, you do some clips to make it look really good. And then you just shove your seam allowance inside, and you just do a nice little top stitch, the straight stitch right here. So you can see I've just done like a top stitch. Now this one's a little bit messier than I would usually like, but anyway. So I got this top stitch done after I flipped it inside out. Done. So I have a waistband, and it's totally finished. And this is weird because you usually don't totally finish the waistband Usually you're going to do a stitch in the ditch. We'll talk about that technique in another time too. But for this type of cartridge pleating, you're going to want to have a finished waistband. So I have my finished waistband that I'm going to use for the skirt. And then I have two fabrics. And this is not super typical for a cartridge pleated skirt. Most of the time, you're going to have a single fabric. But this is for my vampire film, A Shattered Soul. Go see it when it comes out. It's going to be great. It's going to be great. So I'm being real bougie and using all of the things and all of the fabrics. So for this, I'm going to use two fabrics and we're going to cartridge pleat them together. So, but most of the time you're going to use just one fabric. That's most typical. All right, so I have these. We're going to turn into our beautiful cartridge pleated skirt. So we had our waist measurement and we took care of why we needed that and what that's for, right? Now, outseam was the other measurement that we took, right? That tells me how long my skirt needs to be. The width, I guess, can be kind of as long as you want. Obviously, it has to, at the bare minimum, be enough to go around your waist, right? Obviously, if it doesn't do that, it's not going to fit. But if it were just my waist, then I might have like a hobble skirt, something where I can't walk in it, and then that's a whole different period, right? So I have to probably have at least twice, probably like 3 or 4 times your waist, so that you have something more like this. And that's something I can walk in pretty reasonably. Like, that's pretty good. So you want like some fabric so that you have excess that you can then fold in, and so that you have room to move your feet. Again, we don't want to we're not making a hobble skirt. We're not doing that this time around, right? I think this is like 4 3/4 yards. So this is some pretty significant width because I want a lot of pleating and I want this to be very poofy. This is a ball gown kind of look. This is loosely based off of kind of an 1860s Victorian era gown, right? So 1860s, that's when we have the crinoline, the cage crinoline, and the dresses sat on top of those, and the cage crinoline is what makes the dress poof out super far. So this is going to be a wide skirt at the bottom, and it's going to be poofy. So I had to think about that when I was worrying about how long I should make it to then pleat it down into your waist measurement. So I want this to be pretty poofy, and I want for it to at least be able to fit around a cage crinoline. So that might be something where if you already have the crinoline, you can measure the circumference of the bottom and know that your skirt has to be at least that big and a little bit bigger because it's going to go on top of it, right? So that's the minimum amount of fabric you would want, and that's how you get that measurement. 10 yards is going to be like a massive, very poofy, very big skirt. That's probably like the max you would use for a skirt. Minimum, probably like 3-4 yards. But that's also going to depend on your waist measurement and the bottom circumference of your crinoline. So, yeah. So anyway, that's kind of where I got this measurement. I wanted something that's pretty poofy, but not like super crazy poofy. So like 5 yards is like pretty good, and I know that from other dresses I've made, right? So that's how wide it is this way. The length of this skirt, I took my outseam and I measured that to the floor. However, I know that I'm going to be wearing some heels for this. So I'm going to think about how much length these heels are going to add. And these might add like 2.5 inches probably-ish. But then I also want to think about, is she walking in this scene? Is she dancing? Like, what is she doing in the scene? And so where do I want the hem to sit? If you heard about the Cinderella live action, that gown, they made like multiple versions of that dress with different lengths so she could do different activities, right? So kind of think about the hem. You don't want to be tripping on it. You don't want, actresses get their heels caught in hems like all the flipping time. So you probably want it up at least 1 or 2 inches from that, and think about, like, is this a character who slouches a lot or an actress who slouches a lot, and is that going to change the length? So think about the hem, and future you can make the hem, because hem is the very last step we do. But you do want to think about it now when you're cutting, so you're giving yourself some extra length. You don't want to cut it too short. You always want to cut things a little bit longer, and then you can always hem up. So for me, what I did is I had my measurement to the floor, and then I was thinking about, you can see this is like a lot longer. It goes all the way like here to here, right? So for the length, I think I added like 3 inches because I wanted to have a 1-inch turnover here and then a 2-inch hem. And that's pretty good, so I can take it up or down as needed when I get to the point of hemming. And I want to try on the shoes and wear the whole outfit to mark the hem when I do that later. That's why hemming is the very last step, always. Because everything else has to fit and be in the perfect place, and then you can have it. And you have to wear the shoes and the structural garments and all the other things so that you know exactly where the hem is actually going to be. Okay, but for now, I take my outseam, I add 3 inches. That's what I'm doing. Think about your heels. If you've got 6-inch heels or something, maybe add like 6 inches. You know, just think about those things ahead of time, right? You always have to have the very end in mind for every step of the process because that changes how you do things and what you're going to do, like the number of inches you're adding. So, outseam plus 3 inches. Then I added 5 inches at the top. This is because for cartridge pleating, I want to have like a 2-inch section at the top that I can mark and have that be my pleated area. So I want to have a 1-inch kind of a hem allowance, I guess. So I want to fold it over 1 inch, and then I want to fold it over 2. That way I can have a really nice, beautiful finished edge on top. And with these folded edges, it's just going to look a lot cleaner and crisper than if I leave this like this and I try to do the cartridge pleat. It's not going to look as clean. So it's nice to give yourself a finished look by having a fold over and then another fold over. So that from even the inside, I'm going to have a beautiful finished look like this. We always want things to look finished and beautiful as much as possible, while also being able to access seams and be able to change things for the future so they can fit different actresses for different shows, right? That's kind of the goal of theater. So I've added these 5 inches, and what I did also is I measured 5 inches of interfacing. So I have this fusible interfacing that I fused to the very top. This is also not super typical cartridge pleating. I like to do it because it makes your cartridge pleats just look a little bit crisper, and I want a crisper look for this. If you don't want a crisp look, if you don't want them to really have like a little bit more shape, you don't have to do this. I also did this because this fabric is just really limp and it's not really going to hold too much shape, right? It's a very swooshy, delicate fabric. And so I'm giving that to myself to add just a little bit more weight, make this easier. So I've done that. I've also serged the edges. So I got my length that I wanted, right? Based on those measurements we talked about, 5 inches added to the top, 3 inches at the bottom, and then waist to the floor, right? So I have that, and then this, I decided almost 5 yards, but because of the lace, this lace comes in 5 yards, and I wanted to save a little bit so I could use it in some places. So I thought about that, and then I ended up with like 4 3/4 yards. That's how I got that number, right? I also want this to end before this does. So I also thought about that, and I thought about where artistically I would want that to end. And, you know, so this is slightly shorter, just an artistic something that I did, right? So, yeah, so I have these two things, and I need to put them together before I do this next step. Also, I serge this. So serging is a finishing technique. It finishes your edges so that they don't fray out. Oh, look how beautiful that is. If you got just some random fabric, let's see what I got here. Yeah, this guy spraying like the Dickens, right? So I've got these fraying edges that are just gonna pull out, and I'm just gonna fray this every time I touch it, every time anyone looks at it, it just frays out, right? I do not want this to happen to my beautiful garment. So I finish these edges by using a serger to serge those edges. And now as much as I pull, as much as I anything, I'm not getting any fraying. So this is a technique that we, this is the preferred binding technique, finishing technique in theater. The reason is because we take our garments apart and put them back together for different sizes of actors, for different shows. So we take things apart often. So we have to make things so that they are durable enough to withstand being taken apart. If I take something like this that hasn't been serged and is just fraying, and I turn this into a theater garment, and then I go back 2 or 3 years later after this has been sitting in stock and after it's already been used in a show for like a 3-week run and dress rehearsals, and then it was probably abused in its washing, it's been through a lot. And then I pull it out and I'm going to dissect it to try to use it to, take it apart and put it back together for someone else who's maybe a slightly different size. Now I'm going to have this fraying mess on my hands. And it's going to be awful and frustrating, and it's just no fun. No fun. So we serge all of our seams in theater. Here's an exception, I don't need to serge this because this isn't a woven fabric. This is a different textile. This is a netting, right? So it's just like this tulle that has embroidery on top of it. And it doesn't matter how much I pull it, it's not going to fray because this fabric doesn't fray because it's not woven, right? So there are some textiles that you don't need to serge. Like a felt, you probably won't need to serge because that's just like fibers that are like stuck on top of each other. They're not woven. They don't fray out the same way. They can, have fibers that pull off, but that's different, right? So I've gone ahead and I've serged this. If you don't have a serger, it is a specialized machine. And I myself, who has been a professional and working in theater for 11 years now almost, oh my goodness, woof, I didn't have a serger until like 3 months ago. So if you don't have a serger, that's fine. You can also use like a zigzag stitch on your sewing machine. There are also some other stitches that kind of imitate serge in some ways. So you can do that to like bind them off really nicely so that you don't have as much fraying and your garment will last so much longer. Especially since we throw everything into our washers, if it doesn't have to go through that agitation and that horrible process it has to go through, and it doesn't have to fray as easily doing that, it'll just last longer. So even if you're making just a garment for yourself, I do recommend serging because it will just make your garment last longer. It just will. It increases the longevity of the garment, and you'll be just so much happier if it's going to last forever instead of fray apart, right? Okay, so I have this all serged. I have it cut down to what I need. It's serged. One thing with the serger that's really nice too, though. I love sergers. They're the best. They also have a blade. So they've got a blade that cuts things as you sew off that edge. So if you have, you've cut an edge and it's a little wonky, you just throw it through the serger, it straightens it out. It's so nice, it's beautiful. Or if you've got some fraying edges, it'll just chop those off for you. So they're just really great. They're just wonderful. Would recommend, but also only recommend if you're actually going to use them for a long term because they are expensive. Mine was like $400, and that's like mucho dinero, right? I recommend Juki's. They are like the best sergers. I recommend Bernina for everything else. Bernina is the best sewing machine. Swiss made, they're beautiful, all metal parts. They will like last you forever. A Bernina is forever. Okay, anyway, let's get down to the actual sewing now. So that's like all the stuff you got to do ahead of time. I'm not going to show you because in different videos I've shown you how to cut your fabric so you can figure that out. And yeah, this one's really nice and easy because it's just a few measurements. And that's great. Makes your life really easy. So we don't need too much. You don't have to worry too much about patterning. It's basically just 2 rectangles.
Awesome. So that's how we pattern and prepare for making the Cartridge Pleated skirt. The next video has how to sew it all together. So see you then. Thanks for joining me.